Here's my list of the top 10 mistakes healers make in M+. The first mistake is not really a gameplay mistake, but rather a mistake in our mental game. As a healer, it's very easy to fall into the trap of assuming that every time someone dies, it's our own damn fault. After all, we're the ones responsible for keeping the team alive. And indeed, unless they got completely one-shot, there often is something we theoretically could have done to salvage the situation. This can make it difficult to distance ourselves from the event. However, in many of these situations, your teammate was the one who made a major error, whereas you may or may not have made a minor one. So don't take deaths too personally, you're not the only one responsible for keeping the group alive. What I like to do is look at the death log after a dungeon to see if individual deaths were my own fault, and what I often find when doing so is that they weren't. But sometimes they were, bringing up our second mistake, rotation. For DPS players, rotational mistakes are often blatantly and painfully obvious because their damage will be low and the logs will tell the devastating story of their inadequacy. However, healing meters do not tell a similar story. In a clean run, your overall healing might be very low, yet you have done everything right. On the flip side, in a chaotic run, you might have made plenty of mistakes, but there was always so much to heal that your overall numbers still look good. So, in the absence of reliable data, we need to take an introspective. Do we understand our class? I mean truly and at a foundational level. Do we understand what we should do in every situation? If we don't, we should watch in-depth class guides to learn about optimal gameplay. If we do, we should focus on execution instead. Let's record our gameplay and watch it back to determine if our gameplay aligns with our theoretical understanding and where there are areas for improvement. Mistake number 3 is related to rotational mistakes, but is more nuanced. Inadequate cooldown usage. This mistake can take two forms. On the one hand, there are healers who use their cooldowns only when they absolutely have to. As a result, they use their cooldowns much too infrequently, leaving a ton of mana and also DPS efficiency on the table. On the other hand, there are healers who use cooldowns much too freely, using them to solve problems that they should have solved with their main rotation instead, and then not having the cooldowns available when they are direly needed later. If you're finding yourself at either end of that spectrum, I recommend changing the way that you look at cooldowns. I prefer to view some cooldowns as rotational, abilities you commit to pressing frequently, even if the situation does not absolutely require their use. On the flip side, I view other cooldowns as emergency solutions, holding them even for the entire dungeon if their use is not required. On my evoker, for example, I use rewind as such an emergency button, only pressing it when I absolutely have to, usually after I've made a rotational error or if someone else has made a major mistake. On the other hand, I use Stasis and Emerald Communion rotationally, as doing so is highly mana efficient. Likewise, on my Shaman I use Ascendance rotationally and use Healing Tide and Spirit Link Totem to recover from emergency situations. Of course, there's more to cooldown usage than simply categorizing cooldowns as rotational or emergency use, which brings us to mistake number 4, insufficient dungeon knowledge. When I started healing, I found myself playing primarily reactionally, not being able to plan ahead because I didn't know what was coming up next. Unfortunately, this lack of knowledge produces an extremely flawed playstyle. As a healer, you need to do your homework. Similar to how you expect tanks to know a route that amounts to more or less exactly 100% trash percentage at the end of the run, it is your job as the healer to know the damage patterns of enemies in a dungeon and plan your healing around them. Now, although the best way to acquire the necessary knowledge might be to watch a bunch of dungeon guides, not everyone wants to do that or has the time for it. I get it. So instead, I would recommend focusing on paying attention to the dungeon, especially when you're playing on key levels that aren't challenging yet. Because you need to work your way up to higher key levels anyway, you'll usually have plenty of time for noticing abilities that are not dangerous yet, but are likely to become problematic at higher levels. Take note of these abilities and start working on your plan for solving them before you even get to the key levels at which they become a problem. Next, Our story around insufficient planning and inadequate cooldown usage continues with mistake number 5, which is not having a solid tracking solution. For tracking enemy damage patterns, I use the add-ons Big Wigs and Little Wigs in combination with a weak aura called Raid Ability Timeline, giving me this neat little bar next to my party frames to help me set up my healing in advance. Also, you should track not only what your enemies are doing, but importantly also the state your own character is in. Most classes have highly complicated talent trees and talent interactions, and you really need to know which state these interactions are currently in. Unfortunately, the standard Blizzard interface does a terrible job at tracking these important character buffs, and you will want to create weak auras for this tracking instead. I go over how to do that in my How to Improve as a Healer video, which I link for you up here in the corner. Mistake number 6 revolves around decision making in high pressure situations. First of all, when things get so dangerous that people might start dying, you must have your priorities straight. And that means treating yourself as the most important player in the group. You are the healer. If you die, everyone else also dies. Therefore, in high-stress situations, focus on yourself first. Everyone else comes later. Let them use a healing potion if necessary, which they won't do, and instead blame you for not healing, but that's just the name of the game, I guess. Of course, the tank is another player that must not die, but tanks are also quite resourceful in themselves, and if you focus on the tank instead of yourself, chances are that they will also have figured out the problem on their own, and the two of you will have committed your cooldowns to the same player, making the overall situation even worse. So outsource some of the decision making in high difficulty situations to the tank and focus on yourself instead. Also, in high pressure situations, many healers are much too hesitant. I have a PvP background, and one of the things that you really learn as a PvP healer is that some situations require that you use all of your cooldowns immediately. This has helped me a lot for getting into the habit of not holding back on cooldown usage in M+ when a cooldown is direly needed. I'd recommend getting into the habit of overcommitting cooldowns and reflecting afterwards if their use was really necessary, rather than undercommitting cooldowns and having to pick up dead bodies from the ground while wondering if a cooldown could have saved the day. This can also entail using your AoE healing cooldowns to save individual players, which can be counterintuitive, especially for newer players. For example, it's absolutely okay to use big CDs like Spirit Link or Rewind for saving individual players, even if their group-wide healing potential is going to waste. Next, mistake number 7 revolves around playing off your tank. The first thing to note here is that many healers start healing the tank too early in big pulls. With really good tanks, that's mostly not so much of a problem because they are usually quite careful to put some form of aggro generation on every single mob that they pull. That's actually often how you can tell if you're playing with a good tank right at the start of the dungeon. If he's going for a big pull but just runs by the first pack of enemies on his mount, relying only on body aggro, you're often in for a rough time. However, back to the point, if you heal too early, you might draw aggro and get one-shot. Instead, heal before the pull starts, for example through shields and healing over time effects, and then use external damage reduction cooldowns like Iron Bark or Pain Suppression during the pull, as they don't generate any threat. Start healing only after you are sure that the aggro situation is solved, or if it's absolutely necessary. You may also consider using things like Night Elf Stealth to heal and then immediately drop the aggro again. I'd also say that it's generally a rather solid blanket solution to use an external like Iron Bark or Pain Suppression on the tank at the start of a big pull, just to make the whole situation a bit easier for everyone. Next up, mistake number 8 is not using your utility. Most healers have significant potential for mob control with interrupts, stuns, fears, or disorientation spells. However, many healers focus too much on healing and too little on mob control, not realizing that successful mob control can drastically reduce healing requirements. Take the pack of disturbed kelps in front of Swamp Face as an example. If they start spinning, many healers try desperately to heal through the damage, even though a simple button press would have stopped the madness altogether. And for mistake number 9, I have put dealing damage. That's right, not dealing damage, but dealing damage. And that's because I believe that many healers have the whole damage dealing thing backwards. At the behest of optimal play, they focus way too much on dealing damage way too early. If ever a single player dies while you are trying to squeeze an additional 10% out of your low healer damage, it's never worth it. In my opinion, the correct way of becoming proficient at dealing damage as a healer is to not focus on dealing damage. Instead, focus on your healing rotation, dungeon mechanics and mob control until you can do these things in your sleep. This creates security for yourself and for your group, and you can then slowly begin integrating and optimizing damage dealing within the confines of this safety net. And finally, for mistake number 10. Many healers don't drink often enough. When they run out of mana during an encounter, it could often easily have been avoided had they sat down to drink 5 minutes earlier between pulls when their mana was at 78%. So just make it a habit to sit down to drink whenever you can, even if your mana is at 90%. You never know when you might need those extra 10%. If you want to learn more about improving as a healer in M+, check out this video. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and I'd be honored if you would consider subscribing to my channel as well for more future content like this. Thank you very much for watching, everybody, and see ya.